Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Transfigured. I am here with Aaron Renn. Aaron is a writer and consultant based in Indianapolis. He's probably most well known as the author of Life in the Negative World, Confronting Challenges in an Anti-Christian Culture. His works have appeared in The Guardian, The Wall Street Journal, and Atlantic, among others. I first met Aaron at a conference in Chicago, kind of hosted by the Chicago Bridges of Meaning group. And I should say that we are hosting another conference again next August. I'll leave the details for that. But Aaron was at the first one. It was a little bit rough and ruddy, I feel like, a little bit of a shoestring budget sort of affair. But Aaron hosted an episode of his podcast with Paul Vanderklay there. And that's where I originally met you.
Yes, I remember that well.
Yeah, good. So the first question that I wanted to ask you about is regarding Chicago. Obviously, we're based here in Chicago, and you've had some controversial tweets about Chicago, at least from the perspective of us Chicagoans, that Chicago is something of a second-rate city for opportunity to reach the highest ladders of a career.
Yeah, I actually lived in Chicago for about 20 years, and Chicago really had an incredible transformational effect on me. You know, for some people, going to college is this time of sort of exploration and transformation and all those sorts of things that you go through as you kind of move away from home for the first time. It really wasn't that for me. I mean, I had a good time in college, but I didn't really feel like college was very transformational. But moving to Chicago, after having grown up in a rural area, definitely had a profoundly transformational effect on me. Ended up creating my first, kind of call it online persona as the urbanophile, Phile, the lover of cities. And so I certainly always will have a soft spot in my heart for Chicago. I was up there a couple times last year. Chicago is, I think, right now probably the best price performance city to live in the country in terms of just not in the suburbs, but in the city in terms of just like what you get in terms of like genuine urbanism at a price far far below whatever you would pay most other places. Now there are some downsides of that. Obviously, right, the governance in Chicago is horrible. The finances are horrible. All of that sort of thing, and definitely, Chicago is sort of a diversified regional business capital, but is far less of a global center than, say, a New York, a San Francisco, a Los Angeles, or a Washington. That's just the reality. It's not the home of any globally important strategic macro industry like finance in Washington or tech in Silicon Valley. It has some things. The CME Group is probably the world's most important financial exchange, so it's got good stuff that differentiates it from most other cities of its type. But definitely, I would say, if you are in that top handful of percentage points of people in terms of maximum ambition and talent, you're not going to get the opportunities in Chicago that you would get in a New York City. That's just a reality. But frankly, that's a pretty small slice of people there. And for the average person who graduates, from a Big Ten school, Chicago's still a tremendous attractive choice.
Okay.
Or even SEC schools. I'm seeing the Alabama flags there now, of course, and because the SEC's rising. I mean, that's one of the things that's like, a lot of my work focuses is when cities focused on the Midwest and like, what do we got to do to turn this thing around? And I think the rise of the SEC schools as destinations, really shows like the rise of the South as a demographic and economic growth engine of the country. And so you've got kind of the South, which is this massively exploding area. You've got these historic coastal centers like New York, Boston, D.C., and that kind of leaves the Midwest a little bit out in the cold, so to speak.
Yeah,
And that's just
literally
reality.
sometimes.
Indeed. We had another polar vortex this year, albeit brief. Thank you.
Yeah. Although I will say I work for Google remotely. So even though as much as I pride myself in being a Chicagoan and am loyal to my city, I do kind of agree and understand what you're saying, that I kind of had to go elsewhere to find the job opportunities I was really looking for.
Yes, I would say, uh, yeah. So there you go. I mean, there is. It's one of these that there is a Google office, of course, in Chicago, and they're going into the state of Illinois building, which is going to be a huge impact there. But my impression is that there are far less engineering resources. The engineering side is much smaller in Chicago, and it's like when you start looking at the actual functions that are based there, it's sometimes having an office of one of these companies is not. They're not all made the same. Although of course the brand is great.
Yeah, a lot of the jobs in the Chicago office are like the ad account management of businesses based in the Midwest.
Yeah. Basically, of course, Chicago's a huge ad center. I mean, that's one of the
Hmm.
things that it definitely has. And there are definitely, industries that Chicago's great in, like kind of food and consumer products. I think there's still a lot of powerful stuff there. If you wanted to start a food company, definitely Chicago's a place to do it.
Yeah. So I do have one question from my friend Dan Wagenmaker about Chicago, is he feels like sort of the Obama administration was in some sense the political spirit of Chicago that then sort of got moved to Washington, D.C. and was sort of running the world for a while. Although I think it's been a bad couple weeks for the globalized Chicago political machine, and so that one of perhaps Chicago's major exports was politics.
Yeah, it could be, So, Chicago, and I think that is something that is, if you're going to say something in Chicago's favor, you have to say that it was a platform for Barack Obama's political ambitions. Uh, it worked out very well for him,
Yeah,
and for some others. I mean, Chicago's always had an outsized role in Democratic politics.
yeah. So now I want to ask you about your book, The Negative World. Do you want to sort of just outline the basics of your thesis for people not familiar?
Sure. Well, the idea of the book and the negative world concept goes back to 2017. I published it the first time in 2017 in my newsletter when my newsletter was very tiny. And in fact, it went viral then, and it was probably the thing that put my newsletter on the map. Then it was updated and published in First Things magazine in February 2022. Maybe became the most discussed article in the history of the magazine. And then I turned it into a book, A Life in the Negative World. And basically, the core of it is this three worlds model that I created that basically says, look, unlike Europe, we never had a state church. But for most of our histories, we had a sort of softly institutionalized generic Protestantism as our default national religion. And even as recently as the 1950s, um, when that had morphed from maybe less of a Protestant and more kind of trending generic Judeo Christianity, it was still like it was still the case. So you had half of all adults attending church every Sunday. There were prayer and Bible reading in our public schools. We were adding "In God We Trust" to our money and "Under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance. That's the kind of country it was. Then in the 1960s, this all began to become unraveled. And the status of Christianity went into decline in America, a decline that continues to the present day. And I divide this period of decline from roughly 1964 to the present into three eras or worlds that I call the positive world, the neutral world, and the negative world. So the positive world lasts from 1964 to 1994. And in the positive world, I want to be clear about one thing. Christianity is in decline. It is not, things are not going well, right? Church attendance is down. And yet, Christianity is still basically viewed positively. To be known as a good church going man makes you seem like an upstanding member of society. It makes people want to hire you, vote for you, those sorts of things. Christian morality is still the basic moral norms of society, and if you violate those standards, you could get in trouble. Then in 1994, we hit a tipping point and enter the neutral world. which lasted from 1994 to 2014. In the neutral world, Christianity is not seen positively anymore, but it's not really seen negatively yet either. It's just one more lifestyle choice among many in a sort of pluralistic public square. And Christian morality has a certain residual effect. Then in 2014, we had a second tipping point and enter what I call the negative world, where for the first time in the 400-year history of America, official elite culture now views Christianity negatively, or certainly at least skeptically. Skeptically is probably a better way to think about it. To be known as a Bible-believing Christian does not help you get a job in the elite domains of society. Christian morality is expressly repudiated and, in fact, is seen as a new threat to the new public moral order. And so this has been very dislocating to American Christians, to say the least.
Yeah, sure. So do you, I sometimes feel like there's a little bit of regional variation in this too. Your mileage might vary depending on where you live. Would you say that that's part of it?
I would say yes in some respects. Certainly, I live in suburban Indianapolis now, and in some ways, it's still neutral to positive. Even you don't, if you're ever, almost everybody goes to church up here, and seems like, and nobody really cares if you do. On the other hand, no matter where you are in America, even the rural Indiana town that I grew up in, the ideologies around race and gender that we associate with some of the woke, it's in your schools, it's in your libraries, it permeates every institution. Your kids are probably all been catechized off of TikTok there, and so definitely in a sense, there's no escape from kind of the new landscape that you're in. Though of course it varies. There's an old quip, I can't remember who said it, that the future is here. It's just unevenly distributed.
Mm-hmm.
That, and even within the elite coastal cities and the different places like that, it varies depending where you are. Having lived in New York City for a while, I was surprised. New York City is actually a very religion friendly city, in my opinion. Might be very different in Boston or San Francisco.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah.
Yeah, and do you feel like it's also a little bit different, maybe depending on your age? Sort of like how the future is here, but unevenly distributed geographically. It's unevenly distributed demographically, and what age group you're hanging out with. If you're, 70 or 80 and spend most of your time with people of that age, you still kind of have the culture of that previous age that you're talking about.
Yeah, sure. And then a lot of the boomers, they retired to places like the Villages, Florida, that literally the demographics of the country are still like the demographics they grew up in. It's like all white people and like all boomers, and it's they're still living in like yesterday's America to some extent. Now, I would say, it's interesting. There's been a lot of reporting about different trends among Gen Z, which even suggesting that young men are actually, church attendance might be up for young men, obviously from very low levels, much lower than the boomer levels. So one thing I will say is that trends don't go just linearly forever. So as I said in the book, I don't think Christianity is destined to have a going out of business sale in America. A lot of these trends go on for a while and then they just hit a plateau. So, for example, out of wedlock births, we're just going like this, and then all of a sudden we hit 40% and essentially flatlined at 40%. So why did we flatline? Not clear, but it did. And now, so maybe there's some sense in which, with Gen Z, we're sort of bottoming out on some of these things. Who knows? Who knows? But it's interesting to see that particularly young men in Gen Z have kind of a different perspective.
Yeah, I somewhat wonder if there is almost a little bit of self-conscious contrarianism, though, to the Gen Z men who are adopting a more religious posture or identity, where it is in many ways perhaps a reaction to the such strongly negative world setting that they find themselves in, and a world that often seems to criticize masculinity or manhood itself, and that it's perhaps not a sign of a return to a neutral or a positive world, but in many ways a reaction against how negatively the world has viewed Christianity, and they're sort of taking it as a maybe a contrarian badge of honor or something like that.
Yeah, it's here's kind of what I say is it's hard to disentangle some of these trends. So there are a lot of trends, for example, young men being more conservative, young women being more liberal. Trends that are global in nature. This sort of intersexual conflict among young people is like, oh, it's happening in South Korea. It's happening in some European countries. And so it's hard to attribute that to something specific in the United States or to religion simply because of that. And then so I do think what we've seen is there has been talk of a revival of Christianity in America, and there is to some extent, but I think we have to be careful. I think that the most interesting example is Richard Dawkins wrote The Selfish Gene, was one of the new atheists who I think now calls himself a cultural Christian. Doesn't mean he believes in Christianity. He just now views some of the most extreme woke stuff as a greater threat than religion ever was. And so I think there's a sense of some people that if you want to push back against this sort of leftist fringe, you have to have kind of an alternative moral vision anchored in a religion. You got to have something behind that. And because the kind of woke kind of complex was more negative and hostile towards Christianity, the people that oppose that are maybe like, well, maybe we'll be pro-Christianity. It is sort of a reaction. But then you ask, like, are they really like into Christianity because they believe in it, or does it have a utilitarian kind of point of view to it? And I don't think it's all necessarily like either or. I think all of our beliefs are more complexly determined than we would like to admit. We would all like to think that we believe what we believe because we think they're true, but in fact, that's really not the case, right? Even for so I do think there's some like reaction there. I do think it's tied into a greater matrix of issues. There's no doubt about that.
Mm-hmm. So I grew up, here in the Chicago suburbs in the North Shore, you could say, and that I feel like I felt kind of all three phases of what you're talking about in various stages of my life. In the Chicago suburbs, it was still kind of your parents, if not your grandparents or your friends' parents and maybe their grandparents, did sort of expect you to go to church, and often sort of a waspy kind of mainline sort of church would have been the most respectable. But maybe in school, it was starting to be not particularly cool to be a religious person. Maybe it's never been cool in high school to be overtly religious, but you could start to feel like that idea, like maybe our parents and grandparents respect that, but we don't really respect that. And then I went to Cornell University I started in 2007 through 11. And there was an incident on campus where one of the Christian fellowships, not my Christian fellowship, had their president come out as gay and take a boyfriend and wanted his fellowship to affirm that. And they're like, well, no, we just can't do that. That's against our bylaws. We're connected to a denomination that has clear stances on that. You're welcome to come, but you can't be president or in a leadership position if you're not going to agree with our statement of faith and our behavioral standards, etc. And this ignited a firestorm on campus where there were big protests. The Gay Straight Student Alliance was, leading big pushes in the student government to get all Christian groups that wouldn't sign basically a series of bylaws saying that people, regardless of their sexual orientation, could be in leadership. If your group wouldn't sign that, then maybe you should be kicked off campus or defunded or something like that. And it was a really intense negative reaction to kind of Christianity. And we Christian fellowships at Cornell felt like a very vulnerable small minority without really any allies in high places. And it was really kind of scary to see the strength of that reaction and to think that these, my fellow classmates, are going to be the leaders of future generations. And so
No,
I was,
so this is why I think, people like the three worlds models because it fits with their experience of their lives that they've seen.
mhm.
I feel like that's really like part of it. Like, it wasn't like people liked it because they thought I was such a genius in coming up with these ideas, but especially a lot of pastors, they thought, well, this this gives me a language to talk about what I've already been seeing and making sense of the world, and I've already noticed a lot of things, and so that I think that's one of the reasons it's done so well.
Mhm. How much do you think the shift is really due to just a change in sexual ethics and morality at sort of the popular cultural level?
I think that has a lot to do with it. Um, uh, but abortion was long a flashpoint. Maybe you include that. I think the sort of racial issues, definitely there's something related to those as well. I think it would also be related to many of these other sort of vices that now everybody loves. I mean, pot legalization, gambling legalization, all of these things that you know um, evangelicals were against for a long time, which they've kind of disappeared on a lot of them because the world just. I mean, that's what I mean. The world has just kind of moved on. It's like you can't look around at the gambling intertwined with all of our major sports leagues and think that this is any kind of a remotely Christian society, and at least as traditionally understood, which would have been even if it wasn't, a lot of these vices, if you will, people were like, look, you can't ever get rid of them completely, but you can at least like not like make them like the mainstream thing. You have to make it like the mainstream thing you encourage everybody to do, which we're doing today. And then I think also I'd add to that something around. I think there's a tremendous belief, and somewhat of a correct one, that evangelicals are the reason that Republicans keep winning elections. And although I think the Republican Party is becoming a post Christian right, and the core Trump supporters are really not evangelicals for the most part, it's undoubtedly the case that the 80% Republican voting skew of evangelicals for a block that large means basically Republicans can't win at the national level without that vote. And so, definitely, people on the left just have a simple political hostility to um, Christianity on that respect because they view it as propping up people like Trump that they don't like. And of course, so you see like I would say the average article in the media today that attacks Christianity has little to nothing to do with sexuality, and it's much more likely to be about Christian nationalism or something of that sort. So I think a lot of people want to try to reduce things to sexuality because it seems like it's just a very convenient. It wants to just isolate everything to one particular set of issues, but I don't think that's the case.
Which is the chicken and which is the egg, do you feel like, in terms of sort of the political alignment with evangelicals with the Republican Party? And is it the left elite part of the country sort of reacting against that leaning of the evangelical vote towards Republicans? Or is it the increasingly post-Christian nature of the political left that drove evangelicals to the Republican Party? Or are those two forces too kind of intermixed to really tease apart?
Well, it is important to recognize that uh, evangelicals were originally Democrats. Um, Jimmy Carter was the first evangelical president of the United States, and you may recall there were a lot of concerns by some people that, like, what's it going to mean to have this Bible thumper in the White House? And I think James Davison Hunter, the eminent sociologist from the University of Virginia, his first book was in like 1982 or 1983, called I think American Evangelicalism, and he cited some polling research that even then a plurality of evangelicals identified as Democrats, even though they may have voted for Reagan. And really, I'm not like a complete expert on how it came about, but there was a movement in the late 70s and the early 80s known as the New Right. When people talk about, a lot of people talk about a new right today. There's nothing older than a new right. I mean, there's always a new right. But the main thing that was called the New Right came in the 70s and 80s, and it was a little more populist. It was, there hasn't really been a great history of it written, so far as I know, but it led to things like the creation of the Heritage Foundation and stuff like that. And really, the New Right people got very connected with folks like Falwell and Jerry Falwell, and they were sort of brought into the Republican fold over the course of the 1980s. Through a number of probably a number of ways. It was really the 1980s that evangelicals really realigned into this sort of Reagan coalition. And so I think some of it is related to broader demographic realignments that may not have anything to do with religion. But I do think it's interesting there that evangelicals would not have been considered particularly political. I think, nor would to the extent that they voted Democrat up through the 1970s. But it's really in the 1980s that the religious right, as we understand it, emerged.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that sort of creates this spiral where the Democrats are reticent of the Republicans' religiosity, the Republicans are reticent of the Democrats' irreligiosity, and it sort of creates this polarizing?
This is nothing remotely asymmetric. I mean, the left has been the aggressor on the cultural front in everything. Mm-hmm. I mean, the right has been playing defense on basically every issue for as long as anyone can remember. There's been very little, if any, kind of cultural advance made by the right. One example, one kind of exception might be something like gun rights, where there has been a kind of very expansive movement of gun rights. But the Second Amendment people are very populist. They get little to no support from like big money, elites. They're not loved in the conservative think tank worlds. That was like almost like a movement that took place kind of outside of the traditional conservative infrastructure. And groups like the NRA were always careful to make sure that they never became overly affiliated with the Republican Party. Their basic view is we're in the gun business, and if you are a strong pro-gun rights Democratic incumbent, we will endorse you. And they did. They got they endorsed plenty of Democrats because they're like, our issue is guns. Do what we want. We don't care what party you are. Which I think there's some lessons in that. So I'm not saying there's none, but it's like rarely is rarely is there that much cultural aggression, I think, coming out of the right. And to the extent that they're perceived as culturally aggressive, it's because they want to undo something that the left actually successfully implemented. So like the anti-DEI push, you can say it's culturally aggressive, all these, executive orders Trump is signing to push it out, but like, it's not like he's really replacing it with anything like some other, I got some other, cultural ideology that's innovative and new that I'm pushing. Mm-hmm. the reality is, as we've seen for the last 10 years, they're coming after you on everything. And like, no matter where you are, every institution. So, you basically either have to sort of go along with what the sort of kind of the left wants, or you have to fight back. Those are your two things, because they're extremely culturally imperialistic.
Hmm. Um, what do you feel like in terms of the vibe shift that people are talking about and that feels to be happening? Is this maybe, do you feel like the negative world starting to hit maybe its plateau and recede a little bit? Is this maybe just sort of a temporary conservative backlash win on the inevitable slippery slope that can be a little bit bumpy sometimes? How do you think that this will affect things going forward?
Sure, I don't, again, I can't predict the future. I don't like to make predictions about the future, exactly what's going to happen. But here's my analysis, such as it is. I definitely think the woke movement is in significant decline. Kind of the woke movement really started in Obama's second term. 2014, I think, right around the negative world, there's a lot of things that were going on there. And I think the woke revolution was one of them. And I think what has happened is, 10 years on, I mean, the country got sick of it. And kind of now that Trump won the popular vote, and people just got fed up with all the DEI and all the craziness. And, it turned against it. And I think this is so. I think even mainstream Democrats are looking for ways to try to like put the left back in a box, kind of thing. And so you definitely see it. So every time I open the paper in the morning, there's another corporation saying they're getting rid of their DEI, goals. Now they're not really getting. Believe me, these companies are going to continue focusing on diversity, and that's fine actually. Most people are not like, let's be anti-diversity or something like that. But it's when you've got these ideologies which are explicitly anti-white and extremely like they're getting. And so I really think actually the Bud Light fiasco was a key moment, because it was the very first time a corporation took a huge financial hit for some woke thing that they'd done. And I think it was an incredible gift to corporate CEOs who, I can tell you, they were already feeling that like their activist employees had sort of taken over. And like there was too much politics inside the company. And they're like, what is going on here? And I think Bud Light gave the CEOs and the boards the strength that they needed to say, no, we're not going to do this stuff anymore, because it's now it's a risk to our business. Okay, people. And so we're not going to stop trying to increase minority representation or something like that. But, these extreme things, we're just going to get them out. And so you can see it, and you can see that the business, American institutions are much less hostile to Trump this time around. And so I think to the extent here that sort of a kind of, anti-Christian, kind of aggressive anti-Christianity was bound up with that woke matrix, it is definitely going into decline. I think there's going to be less overt hostility of the type that you saw in the past. Now, that does not mean I think that we're going, that society is not kind of continue trending in a certain direction. So I think if you actually try to, quote unquote, legislate morality, there's going to be big blowback about that. And I think, okay, you're a state legislature and you try, if you're a Republican, evangelical Republican that actually tries to ban abortion, you are going to get a massive blowback on that. Okay.
Mhm.
So
What about gambling?
What?
What about gambling? What
Well, I
if
was going to say,
a state legislature decided to ban, online sports gambling? What do you, I feel like that one's a weird one because it's almost all male who engages in it. And so sort of the kind of the left leaning, mentality might not be against banning gambling, but it still feels puritanical. So I feel like that one could be a weird test.
Well, that's what I mean. Is like, look, the public wants gambling to be legal. The public wants pot to be legal. And the reality is, we're not going to be banning gambling. Now, we may put some reforms in to ameliorate some of the worst abuses and things of this. I'm not saying there's not going to be some, just like there's sort of a pushback against the smartphone. We're going to keep banning smartphones in classrooms, and we're going to like restrict young people's access to porn. And, you know, but we're not getting rid of smartphones. I mean, I think that's one of the things to keep in mind is like, we're not going back to when and that's just reality. So we're living in a culture, right, that's going to be pro pot, pro gambling, still probably largely pro porn. To the extent that there's any anti-porn movement, it's coming out of the secular men's right. It's not coming out of religion. It's very libertarian, culturally libertarian. Doesn't want to be told what to do. And again, I think the COVID lockdowns had a huge impact here. That was another really, really critical event because of this full spectrum institutional pressure, including legal pressure from governments, financial pressure, was brought to bear to force compliance and shutdowns, and it didn't work. I mean, I think if the COVID lockdowns had achieved the compliance rates, very high compliance rates, and there weren't all this pushback, that playbook was going to get run over and over and over again on different topics. And now I think there's like a realization that the American public is so ornery that they just kind of push back against that. And I think that was a huge moment when so many people were like, we're not getting vaccinated. We're not going to do this. We're not doing that. We're not wearing the mask. And again, I think some of that to me is like not my cup of tea, but it did have the effect of showing that even with all the forces that they had at their disposal, firing you from your job if you won't get the vaccine, for example, kicking you off airplanes if you don't wear a mask, they couldn't make it happen. And I think that's that is a really powerful kind of reality. And so, that's, that's something there. So I think that we're kind of in an era where we're definitely going to be post-Christian, kind of a post-religious right, culturally. At the same time, that negativity I do see easing. And I think that there are some indications that, certain aspects of our culture are becoming more friendly to Christianity. And I think ironically, it's kind of on the cultural right landscape where that's happening, where there were so many of these evangelicals who said things like, well, your public witness will forever be destroyed if you support Trump. And now it's all these people who are actually kind of being attracted to Christianity through coming out of that side. It's so you can't really predict, right? You can't necessarily predict, but that's kind of what I see the landscape at present.
So I'm thinking about how post-religious the right will be, and at some level, there's never been a more post-Christian Republican president than Donald Trump, who has multiple divorces, public affairs. His sexual and moral history is quite well known and was well known before he ever ran for president. But then J.D. Vance will tweet something quoting Catholic social doctrine and Thomas Aquinas about rightly ordered loves, and suddenly all that Twitter can talk about for the next day or two is rightly ordered loves and Catholic social doctrine. So is it going to be post-religious like Trump, or are we going to be arguing about Thomas Aquinas and Augustine?
Well, now again, I don't think Thomas Aquinas wanted to completely ban prostitution because he thought it might, there may be some things like that, but like, is JD Vance going to get rid of the gambling? Is JD Vance going to get rid of the pot? And so we'll see. And sure, JD Vance talks. He does. I mean, I'm not saying there's obviously religious politicians for certain, but we'll see. We'll see how it goes. I mean, if you look at the Trump administration, it's you can argue about the order, rightly ordered loves, to justify immigration policy, but that's not like nobody created these immigration policies after a thorough scholarship, look into what Thomas Aquinas had to say about it. The policies of the Trump administration have little to do with Christianity. That doesn't mean they're necessarily opposed to Christianity. I actually am of the opinion, that Christianity actually doesn't tell you how you're supposed to govern the country in any real specifics. I think we need to this is one of the things I feel like, the evangelicals were like, everything tends to be proof text back to scripture. It's like, I just, I think we need to get out of that mentality, there, but you wouldn't have said like, is this the, is this the Christian administration? I don't know that you would necessarily say that in terms of like, I don't see that there's any obvious inspiration for what they're doing. Coming from Christianity, even if they would argue that, of Christianity or Catholic social teaching or whatever, has to say about it.
You talk a lot about sort of the importance of culture making and movie writing and other sort of creative endeavors like that, and how that almost always seems to be exclusively owned or dominated by the left in terms of the creative industries and output. But I can't help but feel like especially the woke part of the left just sort of ate that creative aspect alive. Like I was on Twitter yesterday, I saw something like, the top 12 movies that came out in like 1995, and like every single one of them was better than any movie that had come out in like the last 10 years, and they're all coming out within months of each other. I feel like the left's ability to put out attractive cultural stuff was sort of inhibited and even somewhat destroyed or depleted by the woke stuff. And it sort of left that mantle open, but I haven't seen it quite really fully captured by the right wing either, that opportunity taken advantage of.
Yeah, well, here's what I would say is what you're saying is absolutely true. And part of it is because they became too overtly political. You can't, it's hard to tell an explicitly political vision. I actually say great art is right wing, and I talk about, take a guy like Michel Houellebecq, who's probably France's greatest living novelist. He's a huge bestseller over there, and he's not a Christian. He's kind of a misanthropic guy in a lot of ways. You read his books, and they're definitely right wing in terms of their analysis of the culture. His first book was called, I think, Whatever. And it sort of like, it became a very formative book in the manosphere. It came out in the 90s. And is sort of like talking about this dystopian sexual landscape that we have. And he talks about how, pure neoliberalism in the economy produces vast income inequalities. And he's like, the liberalization of sex does the same thing. It produces vast inequalities in which, the alpha males at the top have these harems and everybody else at the bottom is locked out. It's like, and it even has a guy who's a sort of, proto incel terrorist in the book. And it's just so, it's very right wing, right? In that sense. And so when you read great literature often is implicitly right wing, because of its portrayal of capital T truth and like exploration of the human condition. And so I think, a lot of the European literature, is kind of implicitly right in some way. But I do think, the Hollywood, type people, the mainstream culture industries in the United States, they tried to become too political. And like, it's obvious, like, we're going to make Superman a trans, disabled, black, a woman who's, gonna it's like it just was so hokey. The over the top attempt to shoehorn every political thing into all of their categories, and of course they've suffered. They've definitely suffered for that. It doesn't mean, by the way, that the right makes great culture.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you, you read. I read the London Review of Books, what might be my favorite magazine, and like the staggering amount of intellectual firepower present in that magazine, like far outclasses people on the right. Now, that's not like artistic in a sense, but you read like one of these New Yorker feature writers, right? One of these great articles, and you see these like phenomenal pieces done in mainstream. The right simply doesn't have people. If I really would, I thought about putting out a men's lifestyle magazine for a while, and I said, look, I could not identify enough truly top caliber writers on the right to really put out a first class, like old school Esquire type magazine. The articles that were like classics and Esquire, even from the 90s or the 2000s, no one on the right could have write that article. There's a great. I keep coming back to this. There was a phenomenal article in Esquire from maybe 2010 called "The Things That Carried Him." You can read it online, and it was the story of this guy from Scottsburg, Indiana, who'd been killed, I think, in Iraq, either Iraq or Afghanistan. And they like tell his story backwards from the funeral to when and it's like such an incredible piece of writing. I'm like, no, maybe the guy who wrote it is conservative. I don't know, but it's like the talent is not there, the interest is not there, the funding is not there. It's overwhelmingly schlock. Whenever you watch it's supposed to say it's one thing to say the Hollywood movies are bad, and they are, but like the schlock character of so much conservative stuff, and it's just cringiness. It's just it's kind of it's bad.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like that's a reality. Like I think the American right. I mean, I forget the American right. I must focus on evangelicals. Those are not necessarily the same thing. And this is like a project I'm working on. I think you need to take a hard look and self-assess and say, okay, you think that you've got it all right. You're smart because you've got all the right theologies. You're doing it right. You've got it right. Why is it that there are no evangelicals at the Supreme Court? Right? Why is it the scandal of the evangelical mind exists? Right? Why are there no evangelicals like running any conservative think tanks in D.C.? Any major ones? It's like you go down the line. It's like why is there so little like high level output coming out of a group that is so numerically large and which actually does have a lot of talented people in it? I think we should be troubled by the implications of that.
Mm-hmm. So why is it, do you think, that a lot of conservative Christian thinkers are moving towards more traditional churches like Catholicism or perhaps even Orthodoxy? And what do you think that says sort of about the future of the Christian right?
Yeah, well, I think I think there's a few things going on. One, I think people are they're looking for solid ground to stand on. I think, and there's this view that the culture's been dissolving, and I think they sort of I think some of it is candidly driven by a deep alienation from modernity, a deep alienation from America, a deep alienation from kind of the cultural realities that we live in. And so it's why people, they go to the Catholic Church and they join like a Latin Mass parish or a Melkite parish. Or they're like, I think the Eastern, going to Orthodoxy to me is sort of like expatriating. And you have seen that. It's like, I will.
That's a good point.
And I make this point. There's a huge number of Paul Kingsnorth fans out there. They love Paul Kingsnorth, and I'm like, I look at Paul Kingsnorth, and I see a man deeply alienated from the world in which he lived. He expatriated, physically expatriated from a country in which he lived. His family had lived 1,000 years. Then he adopts essentially a foreign faith, some kind of Eastern Orthodoxy. Then he sort of just rejects modernity in general. And like, I think that is a underlying complex of, alienation. Rod Dreher would not be Eastern Orthodox if Catholicism, he had not lost faith in Catholicism, right, through the abuse scandals. And so I think people are looking for solid ground, and they think that, like, they're never going to find it in their suburban evangelical box church, or they're not going to find it. So, and so I think that, there is something to that, to be quite honest. But and so I think that's just simply a part of it there. And I think there's also many other factors, that are there. The Catholic Church, aggressively recruits kind of elites, and they've got a very good story to tell. That's a very highly edited story. They'll talk about Catholic social teaching. Oh, by the way, what really tamed industrial modernity in America was not Catholic social teaching. It was the Protestant progressive movement. They don't want to talk about that. Oh, by the way, the people who wrote our Constitution, they were all Protestants, by the way. It's like, and it's like, oh, the syllabus of errors, we don't hear about that. There's a whole lot of things we don't hear much about.
Right. And Catholicism now, because of so much Protestant critique, has lost so many of the distinctives that Protestants criticized for so long that it's becoming almost similar to Protestantism. And so then people who don't remember what it used to be like then find it attractive.
Or what it is like if you went to Central America, right? Or you went to Southern Italy.
Yeah.
And like, if you went to a Catholic country and saw what like Catholicism was like in those countries, would you be as attracted to it? Maybe you would, maybe not. And so, I think that they've done a good job telling their stories. And on the Orthodox side, definitely Jordan Peterson. There's this sort of people call it the Jordan Peterson to Jonathan Pageau to Ancient Faith Radio pipeline, and you get in there. And believe me, I have never felt any attraction to Catholicism. I do see the attraction of Orthodoxy. It definitely has the most legitimate claim to be doing, basically the same thing they were doing 1,000 years ago, right? They're still kind of doing it. And it's the most traditional. Oriental Orthodoxy, Eastern Orthodoxy are the most traditional churches. So if you're looking for the greatest amount of tradition, I can see why you do that. But of course, a lot of them are like, okay, the fact that like the Eastern Orthodox Church never actually got around to banning slavery, we don't hear about that, right? There was slavery in Constantinople up until the point where the Turks captured it. There's a lot, and again, you look at the Eastern churches; they were very subservient to the state.
They got completely bulldozed by communism.
Right, yeah, and which admittedly, to be fair, and anybody would have been bulldozed by communism. You're in a totalitarian state, you're going to get bulldozed. But the point, I think, being too, really, do you want to live in one of these countries? Do you really want to live in an Orthodox country where the culture is shaped by Eastern Orthodoxy? Most of us don't want to live in Eastern Europe. That's a reality. And the truth is, the reality is that we live in a modern society. Unless the Kaczynski apocalypse occurs, we're going to continue living in a modern society. And Protestantism is the only Christian branch of Christianity that actually understands modernism and modern society because it created modern society. And I think the sad thing is that modern contemporary evangelicals have basically rejected their own theological history and their own cultural history, and as a result, they actually don't have what people are looking for. in some respects. Now, obviously, a lot of people still, become Christian in these churches, so they're good. And the Pentecostals are doing incredible, particularly with people, from kind of lower middle class type backgrounds. So it's all bad. But in terms of, I think, capturing elites for certain, it doesn't really have a compelling message. And I think a big part of it is because they've flat out sort of rejected their own heritage.
Yeah.
And I think you see that every time I read a book that talks about the history of Protestantism and the culture of Protestantism, whether that be Weber's Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, all the way up to James Davison Hunter's new book, Democracy and Solidarity, what they describe as the Protestant culture is completely alien to modern evangelical culture. It's certainly not culturally Protestant in the sense people would have understood it in the past. And even its theology is closer to the radical Reformation than traditional, to the traditional Reformed, Calvinistic influences on the United States. Of course, through the Quakers, we had a big influence, from kind of radical Christianity as well. But you just see it, and I've this debate over this book by a guy named Stephen Wolfe, "The Case for Christian Nationalism," which he's a PhD in political science, and he makes I don't know how to assess it. I'm not qualified to assess it, but he definitely makes very logical arguments drawn from Reformation theologies about politics. And I think what's interesting is, basically the critics of his book, the debates over that book, and I've said I'm not a Christian national, I reject Christian nationalism, but the debates over his book showed me that most evangelicals explicitly reject what the reformers taught. I don't think there is an evangelical reformed denomination today that would not excommunicate John Calvin. I mean, they would. I mean, it's like they would excommunicate the reformers if they showed up today with their beliefs. And so they're essentially Anabaptist belief systems. They're essentially quasi-Anabaptist theologies. Their lack of Protestant cultural heritage is, I think, is a huge weakness. And one of the reasons that, again, it was Calvinistic Christianity that built the great intellectual center of our nation in Boston. I mean, that's a complete product of Puritan culture.
Mm-hmm.
E. Digby Baltzell's phenomenal book, Puritan Boston and Quaker Philadelphia, goes into why Boston became the intellectual, scientific, cultural, political center of the country. Is that's what created it, and we've sort of decided to abandon all that, which is sad because for most of our history, Protestantism would have rightly been seen as the elite option, and Catholicism would have been seen as the kind of peasant option.
Yeah, immigrant option, the ethnic option. Right. It keeps you out of the country club option.
Yeah, and so and maybe there's some class snobbery there that we shouldn't go into. But I mean, when you look at when you look at it, what has happened, and this happened in kind of the 50s. I mentioned we shift from this sort of Anglo-Protestant conception of America to a sort of Judeo-Christian conception of America, which integrated the Ellis Island people, like my family. I'm actually from Catholic peasant stock on both sides of my family. I still have family in Sicily, and sort of integrated them into the American mainstream. And as part of that, essentially all of the specifically Protestant elements of America in its history were sort of de-Protestantized, in a sense. And so, so everything that Protestant Americans did is now just generically American. Mm-hmm. And there's very important reasons why we should do that, actually, and why we should be glad of it, because we don't actually want the American founding to be viewed as proprietary to one ethnic or religious group. We want, again, like my Sicilian ancestors, to feel like that is theirs. And you don't do it if you portray it in a sectarian sense of the word. Just as, we want, hopefully, the children of today's immigrants to have, to identify themselves in, the victories of World War II and, manifest destiny and all of that stuff. And so if you kind of like sectarianize it, then you can't do that. And so I think there's like very good reasons why we don't do it. But the problem is that like, yeah, when like Harvard, Princeton, and Yale, all of the great Protestant institutions, all the great Protestant history has now been recapitulated in essentially generic American. Then what do you point to in the past? It's and say that you produce. So the Catholics, that's been a great boon to Catholic recruiting, because now they have also now they've delighted on being part of the mainstream of American culture, but they've never let go of their own particular institutions, their own particular heroes. They know John F. Kennedy was a Catholic, right? They know who the great Catholic heroes of America are, and the great Catholic thinkers, and all of these Catholic teachings, which gives a completely warped perspective on American history. It's like, as if, and so I think this idea that like all Protestant accomplishments are American, but all Catholic accomplishments are both American and specifically Catholic, is like an enormous benefit to them in recruiting. And Protestants need to actually like recognize like, oh yeah, like we did some stuff. So like only the stuff they don't like prohibition, do they blame on Protestants. No, I mean like and political conservative intellectuals are, a lot of them are, candidly, some of them are historical frauds in the way that they portray American history. You can read a history of America for them, and like the word Protestantism basically never appears. And then it's like, oh, it's this Catholic guy rewriting the history of America to essentially, of course, the Puritans. I'll talk about the Puritans and that, but it's like
they burned a witch, and it was a bad idea.
All right, I attended a big conference last year where people whose names you would know were talking about American founding and American history, and every last one of them simply referred to Christianity. I'm like, okay, great. This is like a scholarly conference. It's just Christianity. I don't think it's just Christianity. I don't think we were 98% Protestant country at the founding. And so I think, again, I understand some of the reason and the thinking behind that. And there's good things. We don't want to go back and re-sectarianize the history of the country, but we also have to recognize that, like, hey, guys, like, the Catholics are they have self-interested reasons for promoting those kinds of views of history, because it's a great recruiting tool for them. It's a great recruiting tool for them.
Mm. I liked what you said about Eastern Orthodoxy, or converting to Eastern Orthodoxy, as expatriating. I do feel like, I mean, first off, I should say I've had lots of friends who have converted to Orthodoxy that what I'm about to say does not apply to them. Maybe they liked the art or the history or some other reason. But I do think that, especially for a lot of like the young men in sort of like the ortho bro crowd, that you can see that in some sense they've absorbed kind of the critique that they were getting from school or online media or whatever, that your culture is bad, the patriarchy is bad, your history is bad, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But instead of jumping onto the woke bandwagon to critique it, they instead flipped to a different culture that wasn't being criticized to try and make it their own. And it's not like, okay, so you get told that the Crusades were bad, and so I'm not going to be a Western Christian, I'm going to be an Eastern Christian. Okay, well, you maybe didn't get told in school that the Eastern Orthodox have had an active war front with Islam for over 1,000 years running straight, but it seems to escape that negative pressure that they've sort of absorbed from this kind of woke cultural critique.
Yeah, and how many people who convert to Orthodoxy join the Orthodox Church in America, as opposed to some specifically ethnic church?
Mhm.
Uh, Again, some of that depends on where you live, but like, why not pick the one where they do the liturgy in English?
Right.
That you can like. And by the way, some of the OCA liturgies are incredible. They're very good. It's like they don't want to join the American uh, kind of Orthodox Church.
Mhm. Right. Sort of a xenophilia or something like that.
I don't know, but like I do think it's just notable. Like, okay, great, I want to become Orthodox, but I'm not joining the Orthodox Church, in America. I'm joining the Russian Orthodox Church or something like
Mhm.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think what you said about how we often like the good things that happened in American history that, we can't ascribe it to Protestantism, it's just America. But the bad things that we, whether it was slavery or the witch burnings in Salem or whatever, we can specifically ascribe that to Protestantism or something like that. And Protestantism then just gets stuck with the negative baggage and without the positive baggage. I do feel like there was this pressure slash opportunity. If you can universalize your story, then you can allow new people into it. You can allow immigrants from Sicily or wherever else to identify with this story, but you do need to strip yourselves of the sectarian or racial or other particularities about it in order to make it a universalizing story. And that in a certain way, this enriched and empowered the sort of WASP elite, because they can now be the country that's absorbing all this talent and energy and resources and human potential from all over the world, if you're willing to give up sort of your own particularity in the kind of narrative that's told that makes it a belonging.
Well, I don't know who's given up their particularity, but like only the kind of WASP America was told to give up its particularity.
Well,
The
right.
other
The
groups,
powerful had to give up the
yeah,
particularity to
the other
stay in
groups. And this
power.
goes back. There's some great writings on this. Eric Kaufmann wrote a great book called The Rise and Fall of Anglo America that talks through how some of these things, got going in the early 1900s and the debates. And there were some of the WASPs themselves were arguing that the WASPs and only the WASPs are, need to get rid of their culture, while everyone else must be encouraged to retain their culture. And very weird, things going on. But yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of where we are. So there needs to be something of like an understanding among Protestants that, like, yeah, like, oh yeah, all of our elite institutions, like we actually created those. Like Harvard, Princeton, and Yale were all created to train Protestant ministers, and were actually, even through the 50s, self-consciously thought of themselves as Protestants. They were liberal Protestants, but with kind of the collapse of the establishment in the 1960s, that was sort of wiped away from them, and you know, it's kind of where we are. But yeah, I mean, the answer to the problems. I don't believe the answers to the problems of first century America are to be found in like medieval Catholicism, which is the religion of a peasant society.
So, what do you think in this new sort of negative world where Protestantism, especially Anglo American Protestantism, had to sort of wipe its memory of what it had accomplished and what it was? What do you think? What should Protestantism and evangelical Protestantism do to sort of reset itself and gain its footing and adapt itself to the new situation that it finds itself in?
Well, I think the two things you got to look at is like uh, number one is just the understanding of what was taught in the Reformation. You could be. It's one thing if you're a Lutheran and you get your whole kind of Lutheran approach, but if you look at like the Reformed branches of Christianity, which was really kind of dominant, kind of in the English speaking world, even if it wasn't officially like, a Dutch Reformed church or Presbyterian, it's still like a basically Reformed kind of viewpoint. I think we have to, we have to revisit those, revisit that body of thinking, and which is actually incredibly sophisticated. When you think about, you start learning, and again, during the COVID, it's like, oh, should you, do you have to follow all these rules? It's like, well, Romans 13 says submit to the governing authorities. And by the way, not one person I heard saying that about COVID has ever told illegal immigrants that they should submit to the actual rules of our country. Strangely, they don't ever talk about that. Okay, I say, okay. And so I say, okay, that makes sense. But then, like, what you realize is there's a very sophisticated body of literature about which commands of the authorities are legitimate, illegitimate, and like all these things. It's like, wow, man, they thought through this stuff in like detail and like lots of exception cases and like lots of this and this and this and this. And I'm not saying what the right answer is, but like there was a much, much more sophisticated body of thinking than simply Romans 13 or you're not the boss of me. Kind of like those two. Like actually, there's a lot of smart thinking there, and I think we need to do that. And I think also we need to understand is like, why has American evangelical theology produced such a different culture? So it's one thing to say that it's one thing to say that you believe the same thing, but if the net practice and how you live your life is radically different, like what actually do you believe? What are the hidden assumptions in there that we don't know? And so I think, I think the reality is that you don't have to believe Weber's thesis entirely to realize that it really was Protestant culture that created the modern world. And, part of the problem that we face in America is that there's been a collapse of Protestant values and habits and practices in the people. And as a result, we have everything that's been documented by people like Charles Murray and Robert Putnam. It's been plaguing, the working class. And so I think there needs to be a recovery of Protestant culture in some respects. Not in the same exact way. It's not going to look exactly the same in every era. And I'm not saying the Puritans had it right necessarily. But, you gotta look at those. You gotta look at that. And so I think there needs to be sort of a retrieval project for that at the same time, not a mindless recitation of it. It's not about just repeating the Latin Mass in 21st century America. It's about recapitulating. It's about recapitulating it for today's world and today's reality, because that's what Protestantism has done best.
Mm-hmm. Any closing remarks you want to end this with, Aaron?
I don't think so.
All right. Well, Aaron Renn, thank you so much for coming on Transfigured today. I encourage everybody to check out his book, Life in the Negative World. Thank you very much.
Thank you.